Hello, my name's Andrew Holmes. I am here to review with you the Ethical and Professional Standards material for your upcoming CFA exam. Now, you probably got into the CFA program or decided to pursue a CFA charter because you like things like economics and financial statement analysis. Well, you may not like that, but anyway, you're interested in those things that lead to being a better analyst. You probably didn't start off with the idea that, oh, I really want to study ethics and professional standards of conduct and those types of things. But as part of this program, you're going to need to spend some time on this. So my experience is that people have a hard time picking up significant points in ethics, and it is an area where you can improve. That is to say, your intuition will serve you really well, hopefully, in economics and in equity and derivatives and those types of things. That's likely material that you think about on a regular basis. This material is going to be something where you're going to have to dig in and learn the specifics. That is, you're simply being a good person, being, as you perceive it, ethical, is not going to get you very far as you work through this material or as you address ethics questions on the exam. So as you go through this, be prepared to make notes, underline. Like I said, you've got to dig in and make sure that you are getting this material in the specific, because understanding it in the general is not going to help much on the exam. So what we want to do is we want to start out by talking about what happens if there's a bad outcome. That's a violation. We're only going to spend a few minutes on that, and then talk about what it is that would be violated. So the two big things that we have to do here, there's some other stuff at the end, but the two big things that we have to do are, one, talk about this code of ethics, and we'll see that that is something we can take care of fairly quickly. It's a fairly poetic statement of what would constitute ethical behavior, but then we're going to have to dig in and talk about standards. And it's the standards of professional conduct that is, I would say, where the rubber meets the road, and it's likely the area that you're going to have to spend the most time on as you prepare for the exam. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we're going to talk about a professional conduct review, okay, that is, there is some reason to suspect that somebody who is subject to CFAI's jurisdiction, that is a candidate or a member of CFAI, has committed some sort of wrongdoing. Well, then there is a disciplinary review committee, okay, that is something that is constituted by the Board of Governors, and they have the responsibility to conduct this review to determine whether or not there should be sanctions against a member or a candidate. So the CFAI Institute, through the professional conduct staff, is going to conduct an inquiry if there is some reason to suspect that there has been misconduct on the part of someone who has agreed to abide by this particular code and standards. So how does that occur? Well, there's several ways that we can actually get one of these reviews started. The first would be self-disclosure. So that is, you have done something wrong. In the middle of the night, you have a crisis of conscience. You type out an email and you send that off to CFAI and say, this is what I did and here's all the documentation. Well, self-disclosure. You are a member or a candidate and you have told them this is what I did wrong. They will, in response to that, conduct an inquiry to see if they should sanction you or you kick you out of the program or whatever it happens to be. Also, written complaints. So if somebody, perhaps a client, decides that what you did was unethical or believes that some action you took was unethical, they will write a letter, send it off to CFAI. That'll eventually find its way to the review staff, and they will then decide whether or not this merits an official review, and of course that will start the process. Okay, there can also be evidence of misconduct, such as something that shows up in the newspaper. So somebody was stealing candy from babies or money from little old ladies, and somehow that ends up in the newspaper or some other media source, and as a result, it comes to the attention of CFAI, and they say, oh, well, we better investigate to protect the reputation of the designation and the organization. Now, one thing that you don't want to get involved with is this report by a CFA exam proctor. So the proctors are given very specific instructions, and if you violate any of those instructions, they're going to have a little sheet of paper and they're going to write it up and send that in. And CFAI doesn't release any statistics, but I would suspect that this actual, the CFA exam proctor reports probably are a primary source of these professional conduct reviews. So just as a quick word to the wise, make sure that whatever the rules that are in place on exam day are, whatever those happen to be, make sure you're in compliance and don't mess with the proctors. Okay. Also, there could be indirect evidence in terms of the analysis of exam scores and materials, monitoring of websites, social media, those types of things. So there's a number of ways that we could actually have a review initiated, anything from you reporting it to some sort of a social media stuff that, the Institute was monitoring. All right? So in this case, once we have some reason to suspect that there could, or some reason to believe there could have been a violation, so just because there's a review doesn't mean there was a violation, it just means there's going to be an inquiry. But once we decide there's going to be an inquiry, there's several outcomes that can occur. The good one, if you're involved, is that there'll be no disciplinary sanctions. So they said, well, somebody wrote us a letter, said that this person was lying, cheating, and stealing. And as a result, the Institute convenes a board and convenes the committee and has a review. Well, at the end of it, they say, yeah, I don't think this was a violation. This was just somebody that got mad because they lost money or something like that. So that would be the good outcome if you were the subject of the review. The second would be just a cautionary letter. That is to say, look, this was skirting the edge of what was acceptable behavior, and so there's no real ongoing penalty for that, but it is sort of the idea that you've been sanctioned by your peers. And then they can also, of course, decide to discipline a member, and that could be, the condemnation by your peers. You could have your participation in the program suspended. If you're a charter holder, you could lose the right to use the charter or to use the CFA designation that you had previously earned. So anyway, so a number of outcomes here, and of course, the more severe and more obvious the violation, then the worse it's going to be, from nothing all the way up till to being kicked out of the program. All right, so that's what happens, and those are what I meant by bad outcomes. So if there is we take upon ourselves an obligation to abide by the code and standards, and hopefully we will all live up to that commitment, and we won't ever have to worry about those bad outcomes associated with professional disciplinary committees. Okay? But now let's move on and talk about what it is that we are agreeing to abide by. So there's, again, like I said earlier, there's two parts here. There's the Code of Ethics. That's basically 6 statements that I think you will agree are fairly poetic. And then we will move on into the standards that are sort of, well, I guess you can view the code as being the big picture, and the standards get into the nitty-gritty. So the Code of Ethics, 6 parts. The first one is act with integrity, competence, diligence, respect, and in an ethical manner. Okay? And that applies regardless of who you're dealing with. That could be the investing public, clients, prospective clients, your employer, employees, colleagues, all those sorts of situations. And what this basically says is act in an ethical manner. So point 1 of the Code of Ethics, act in an ethical manner. Well, that's pretty all-encompassing, and it's the reason I call this poetic is because when we say you should act in an ethical manner, well, I think everyone would agree with that. The problem comes in defining what is an ethical manner. So we're going to start out with the very broadest of claims, that is acting in an ethical manner, and then we're slowly, as we get through the rest of the code and then into the standards, we're going to see that we get a much finer definition of these points. So that's number 1. Number 2, the integrity of the investment profession and the client's interests always come before personal interests. That is to say, integrity is going to be paramount, and the client's interest always comes first. So act with integrity, put the client's interests first, and if you're acting in an ethical manner and you are putting your clients first, you're acting with integrity, well, that's going to be a good way to live your life. I think you're going to find very few people that will disagree with that claim. The third part, reasonable care and independent professional judgment. That is to say, when you are acting in your role, okay, as an investment advisor or an analyst or portfolio manager, you have an ethical responsibility to exercise reasonable care and independent professional judgment. So, and when we talk about, we'll see this sort of recurring theme of, conducting analysis, making recommendations, taking investment actions, all that sort of stuff. The best way to summarize that is just all your professional activities. So when you are engaged in professional activities, you are expected expected to the extent that it is a requirement of ethics, okay? Not just law and not economics, but it's an ethical responsibility to have reasonable care, meaning that you are, we'll define that later, but you can think of that as you would exercise care as if it was your own money that was being invested, and independent professional judgment. So you're going to be independent, that is, you're not going to have your judgment tainted by some sort of outside conflict. So use reasonable care, be independent, that's going to be the third part. So the fourth, and I find this to be one of the graceful parts of the Code of Ethics, it says to practice and encourage others, okay, to practice in a professional and ethical manner. So I think that the notion, you can read different, ethical statements from different professional bodies, and they all talk about you should act in an ethical manner. When I say that this is a graceful part of the Code of Ethics, I think the notion of encouraging others, those around us, to act in an ethical manner is a higher standard and I think a more noble standard as well. So we are going to encourage others to act in a professional and ethical manner, and we want to be a credit to the profession. And that's not just that's not to say be a credit to the profession as type of a rah-rah, let's all be wonderful people. That's a good thing, being a wonderful person. Okay, but the point here is that we're going to see as we go through this material that the confidence of the investing public in the markets and in the profession is paramount to all of our interests. So if we can practice and do so in an ethical manner, encouraging the other people around us, the other professionals around us to do the same, well, we'll be a credit to the profession, and we're all going to be better off, both as investment professionals and as the investing public, because of it. All right. The fifth part, promote integrity of the capital markets, okay, for the ultimate benefit of society. So the integrity of the capital markets, again, what we don't want to have happen is we don't want the investing public to lose faith in the capital markets. So the capital markets are a really essential part of the wealth creation process in our society. And in order to have well-functioning capital markets, we need lots of investors, we need lots of independent decision making. And if in general people lose confidence in the capital markets, well, that's going to have really bad outcomes. So what we want to do is uphold capital market rules, and of course, I guess the regulations, I should make sure and underline that as well. And then finally, we want to maintain and improve our professional competence, okay, and strive to do the same for other investment professionals. So again, just like we want to encourage others to practice ethically, okay, we want to maintain and improve, okay, our professional competence, but we also have an opportunity to bring everybody else along with us. So we're going to be competent, and we're going to help our colleagues and friends in the industry to be competent as well. Again, I think looking beyond one's own practice, the actual activities that you engage in, professional activities that you engage in, is again a graceful part of this statement. So 6 parts to the Code of Ethics. And I think these are very high-minded, and I think in a sense I think there's very little disagreement that what the Code of Ethics says would be good for society and would be good for the profession. So I don't see a whole lot here that would be controversial. The trouble with this is that it's at such a high level, it doesn't make for great questions on the exam, right? So if the question is, well, should you be competent or not be competent? Okay, well, not very many people are going to say, oh, you shouldn't be competent, right? So the code of ethics, again, use the word poetic. I think we would all agree that the world would be a good place if everyone lived up to these standards. Okay? But you can think of this as sort of setting the penumbra, the umbrella over the material that we're going to review next, which is going to be the standards of professional conduct. So what we're going to see is that this code of ethics, these 6 statements, are going to flow in to the 7 different standards of professional conduct. And it's here in the standards of professional conduct that you're going to spend most of your time as you study ethics. Also it's going to be where there's probably the highest potential for frustration because there's lots of minutia that you're going to have to get on top of as you work through this. So before we actually dig in and say, okay, let's talk about standard 1, professionalism, knowledge of the law, right? That would be, part 1, subpart A. Well, let's take a look at what the standards of professional conduct are going to look like overall, right? So we'll a quick trip through each of the 7 different standards, and then we'll go back and we'll dig into each of them individually. So the first standard is professionalism. Obviously, this says, look, we are professionals in an industry that has societal importance, so we need to do several things, right? 1, we have to have a knowledge of the law. So you want to make sure that you understand what the applicable laws and rules and regulations are. You're not going to be able to comply with the law or comply with regulations if you don't know them to begin with. One thing that I think you're going to see is really important, and I'm going to talk about it extensively as we go through, once we dig into the material a little bit deeper, is this idea of independence and objectivity. So maintaining your professional independence and objectivity is going to be a key part of being able to honor your fiduciary responsibility, which is to say, look, if I have a debt of loyalty to a particular client, okay, I have to be able to make independent and objective decisions. And when that is tainted, okay, when that doesn't apply, your decision making is almost certain to be flawed. So this idea of independence and objectivity is going to be a big deal, and it's going to be a recurring theme that you see as we go through these 7 parts. Okay, the idea of misrepresentation. Okay, so this basically says be honest, and then the misconduct requirements here. This is what I call the mommy rule, and I'll talk about why it's the mommy rule when we dig in a little deeper. But what it says is don't do anything you shouldn't do. Okay? So it's kind of the catch-22. Standard 2, the integrity of the capital markets. What are we going to do with material, non-public information? Notice that there's 2 words there, material and non-public, so we need to make sure we carefully define both of those. And then we also are going to talk for a few minutes about market manipulation. If you're manipulating the markets, well, then you are going to be destroying the public faith in the capital markets, and that's, of course, going to have sweeping societal impact, negative societal impact. So any attempt to manipulate markets or manipulate prices or to create false impressions of volume are going to be something that would be very strictly a violation of the standards of professional conduct. Third is the duty to clients. Now, all 7 of the standards are going to be important, and you're going to have to spend some time studying all 7 of them, but I don't think they're all created equal. In particular, if you want to think about when is it that it will cause the most anxiety, or I guess the most anxiety at CFAI, or the biggest splash in the press. Is it when we have something with our professionalism and we didn't know exactly what the law said, or is it when somebody does something to, screw up a client, right? I'm not sure that's a very professional language, but anyway. So duty to clients, I think, is actually the sort of the centerpiece of the 7 standards. So this standard number 3, all of them are going to get tested. You're going to study all of them. Okay, but I think you're going to find that focusing a little bit more on duty to clients is something that would make for time well spent, all right? Because violations of this particular standard are the ones that end up in the newspaper and end up in the courtroom and end up with some sort of professional review at CFAI. So be careful about these, and you can I think to the extent that you understand these five subparts, you can leverage that to understand some of the other material that surrounds it fairly well. So first, loyalty, prudence, and care. I'm actually going to take this loyalty, prudence, and care idea and I'm going to companion it with independence and objectivity, because when I go through the standards of professional conduct, I'm going to talk about my 3 pillars. And so that's basically going to constitute the first pillar, and I'll talk about that as we go through again. But nonetheless, this notion of determining where your loyalty lies or adhering to your debt of loyalty to a client, okay, well, that's going to be paramount. If you are doing anything that is disloyal, okay, you are not honoring your fiduciary responsibility, well, that's, in some sense, that is the worst of the ethical violations. So you're going to find that to be very important. Fair dealing, meaning that we're going to deal with all clients fairly. Remember that fair and equal are not the same thing, okay, but we're going to have to strive for this notion of being fair in our dealing with all clients, okay? Not just big clients or not just clients that compensate us in a particular manner, but all clients. We want to be fair with how we deal with them. Suitability, I think you're going to see that this shows up over and over again. I better put an asterisk by A there as well. So suitability, this basically says we need to make sure that any professional activity, that is recommendations, actions, all those types of things, okay, we have considered whether or not the attributes of this particular recommendation, let's think of adding a security to a portfolio, okay, is this suitable for this particular investor? That is, given this investor's goals, okay, that is their objectives, given their constraints, is this suitable for this particular investor? And that's going to be something, again, that we're going to see come up a lot. Okay, performance presentation. Okay, this is going to refer to how we communicate with clients, and we're going to see that there's some subtlety here. And there's also a whole other topic that we can go through, and that's going to be the GIPS stuff, that is Global Investment Performance Standards, that relate to this as well. So this is something that has lots of meat behind it. And then, of course, preservation of confidentiality. We have access to lots of confidential information in our industry, and we should not be loose-lipped, is what this is basically going to say. There's some I guess there's some great guidance in how we preserve confidentiality as we go through. Okay, but what it's basically going to say in the end is, look, if you have privileged information, then you keep it to yourself, right? So under what circumstances can you share that? Well, there are a few. Primarily is going to be with other professionals who are working on the same problem, and a couple of other situations as well. But nonetheless, confidentiality is going to be a big part of our duty to our clients. The fourth standard is duty to employers. So here we're going to have a debt of loyalty to our employer. Just like we have a fiduciary responsibility to a client, we also have a debt of loyalty to our employer. And we're going to talk about what that means, and the implications of that can actually be quite sweeping. And I'm going to give you a mental exercise or tool for how to think about duty to employers when we get to this in more depth. Additional compensation arrangements. So if you are you're moonlighting, you're working outside of the firm, doing something that could potentially conflict with the firm. What are the circumstances under which you can do that? What are the disclosure requirements, that type of thing? And then the responsibility of supervisors as well. And I think that this is sort of the poster child for what, when we think of where do we have to be really, really careful, especially in exam terms. So this responsibility for supervisors is going to require a very exacting, a very high standard for what would constitute safe harbor. So when have supervisors done what they need to do? Well, they're going to have to be very active and very conscientious in order to comply with this standard 4. Standard 5, investment analysis and recommendations. So here we're going to talk about diligence on a reasonable basis. You're going to see this come up again and again. I think it's one of the really important parts of the code and standards. But when we are making decisions, we have to be diligent and we have to have a reasonable basis for what we're doing. We also need to be careful about communication with clients and prospective clients. So how are we communicating our investment analysis, our recommendations, those types of things? And then as I think of it as more of a side note actually, is this idea of records retention down here at the bottom. Well, there are some guidelines for record retention. What this is basically going to say is, well, you ought to make sure that you retain your sources. That is, when you're performing analysis, you want to make sure that you can replicate that in the future if you were ever called upon to do it. But it does make it does make a lot of sense, and it actually does rise to the notion of being an ethical requirement, right? You need to be able to defend what you have said, and you need to be able to show that you were diligent and that you did have a reasonable basis for the actions that you took, right? And almost to the end of this quick review anyway, we're now at Standard 6, Conflict of Interest. And conflict of interest, this is a really important part in the sense that if in the first 5 that we've gone through there's any problem, well, a remedy to many problems that we could run into would be a disclosure, right? So if we're talking about conflicts of interest, what we would prefer to do is to eliminate conflicts of interest, or certainly minimize conflicts of interest. But of necessity in our industry, there are going to be conflicts, and what we're going to need to do is make sure that those conflicts are adequately disclosed, and there's some particular areas of concern around disclosure that we're going to talk about. Also, priority of transactions, so when do we trade for our account versus employers versus our clients, and then also referral fees in the sense of if we're referring a client to some other professional, well, do we get a referral fee for that? Or if we're paying referral fees to have clients referred to us, well, we're going to be very particular about what the disclosure requirements are, because that does, of course, create a conflict, right? And then finally, we can think of the first 6 standards as being something that is fundamental. It wouldn't be unreasonable to say that the first 6 standards would apply to any person that wanted to act in an ethical manner that was an investment professional, right? Now, not everybody has specifically obligated themselves to those 6 standards, but as people who have, or as members of the Institute, we could argue that, well, if you are not living up to those first 6 standards, then you probably ought to examine what you're doing. But this one, the 7th, applies just to you and I, okay? Me as a CFA charter holder and an Institute member, and you as a CFA candidate. There's some specific things that you have taken on yourself that are summarized here. That is the conduct as participants in the CFA Institute programs, and the way we reference the CFA Institute and our participation either in the CFA charter holder exams, or CFA exams, that is going through the examination process, or after we are done with it and are charter holders, how we refer to the designation, those types of things. All of that is going to be summarized here in Part 7B. So that's a quick look at the standards of professional conduct. Of course, the real issue here is not to take a quick look, but it's to actually dig in and make sure that you have a firm understanding of each standard and each of these subparts. An important point might be to note that you don't have to have the numbering system down. You don't have to know that conduct as participants in the CFA Institute programs is 7A. But you do have to know that it is under responsibility, or your responsibilities as a CFA Institute member or candidate, and you do have to know that it corresponds with Part A, that is the conduct of participants. So the numbering system isn't important. But being able to identify which standard and potentially which subpart is potentially being violated in a question, something that you'd come across on the exam, that is going to be important, and you're going to have to know it well enough to be able to identify standard and subpart in order to be able to address a lot of the questions that you'll see on the exam.